Hey guys, so welcome to Unit 10. We are going to go into the Great Depression, the New Deal, and then through World War II in this unit. So it is a pretty big unit. Today's Ed Puzzle is on the causes of the Great Depression. So we're going to touch on some of the things that we did in the last unit with consumerism and some of the 1920s stuff, but put the spin on it as how it helped to cause and bring about the Great Depression. So you know this one there's really a lot in this, so I'm going to try not to go too long, but it's going to be very important for you to take notes, because there are a lot of causes of the Great Depression. It is not just the stock market crash. Okay, that's what we always learn, but there is so much more that truly caused it, much more than just that one stock market crash moment. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. So remember to contextualize this a little bit. The 1920s, the roaring 20s, it was a decade of consumer spending, mass production, increased wages, more leisure time, all sorts of stuff. It looks incredibly healthy on the surface, but just like that term return to normalcy kind of talks about trying to go back to the way that things were, much like the Gilded Age. And remember what the Gilded Age means and what the term gilded means, that it's shiny and pretty on the outside, but it sucks on the inside. That is kind of what the economy was like in the 20s. It looked strong, it looked good, but inside, under the surface, it looked like it was diseased, and that disease kills it in the end of the 1920s. Okay, so of course, income does increase, but there are severe problems with the United States economy. So that's what we're going to get into today. Now, each one of these causes is underlined. It is the underlined things that you really need to make sure that you get written down, and you know be able to kind of work through and judge these causes. Okay, so the first one is a term called overproduction and underconsumption, which, if you just think about what those words mean, it probably makes sense. But because of the mass production of consumer goods, especially in the early part of the 1920s, right after World War One, the supply and demand was being met. There was equilibrium, which is maximizing profit and is healthy. The problem with a lot of the consumer goods during the 1920s is that they are appliances or they're automobiles or things like that. And so they are items, consumer products, that are not normally bought over and over and over and over again. So if they keep the production level to that high level, but then people stop buying it, it's going to create a surplus, and that hurts business. Okay, so you have an overproduction of goods. You're what's the word I'm looking for? You're flooding the market with your product, and there's not enough demand. It's going to hurt the business and industry. Okay, so you don't need as many appliances as what we just talked about. Okay, and so you're going to see a lot of products just sitting there on the sales floor. And you're going to start to see some businesses actually go belly up before the Great Depression even happens. And this is one of the things that we have to understand is certain industries, especially farming, and we'll get to that in a minute, they enter a recession type close to depression in the 20s. It's not the end or into the 30s when it hits the rest of the nation. You can kind of see the symptoms early on in the 1920s. Okay. So the next one, it kind of goes along with overproduction and underconsumption, is weak industries or weakened industries. A lot of your old core industries, right? Railroads, textiles, steel, coal mining, they become barely profitable because of a shift um, in industry. New competition like cars, automobiles are going to start replacing railroads. Synthetics are going to start replacing textiles, natural gas, things like that. So it's challenging the status quo of the strongest industries from the Gilded Age. And so this is going to cause a little bit of um, you know, unstable footing when it comes to the 1920s. And weak industries by itself is not a big problem. Innovation happens. The problem is when it is lumped in with all of these other causes, and simultaneously happening is going to cause the breakdown of the American economy. So you can't look at any one of these that we're talking about by itself. You have to group it with all of the other causes together. It is a perfect storm that brings America down. All right. So the next one, I alluded to it a little bit, depressed farming. Um, we had really mass production of agriculture during World War One. We were feeding not only our troops, but also people overseas, European populations. And so there was, just like in consumer products, there was a very high demand. Now, after World War One, there's a decline in the demand for American agricultural goods, and a lot of that is because a lot of Americans that started doing victory gardens during the war continued doing it, and so they weren't buying products, and agricultural commercial farms were getting hit very hard. And so there's overproduction again. Crop prices are going to fall 40%. And, we've seen this movie before. When crop prices fall and farmers are not making the money that they should be making, oftentimes they think they're fixing it by producing more. If I need to make more money, then I need to work harder. I need to make more, but that only adds to more overproduction, and prices get driven down even more. Okay. So it really is an evil cycle that farmers get stuck in. And this is in the mid 1920s. And so while we talk about the roaring 20s in the urban areas, in agricultural areas, it is anything but that. Okay. All right. So we also have farmers were unable to pay back loans. Many of their farms are foreclosed on during the 1920s. Some of your early banks that are failing will be the ones in the rural areas before the big bank run of 1929, 30, 31, and 32. So this is happening all the way back in the mid 1920s. Okay. And here you can see a little graph that's kind of showing you farm mortgage foreclosure rates. And so, again, this is not during the Great Depression. This is during, quite literally, the 1920s, the roaring 20s. And so, this is another symptom that we're going to see grow towards, the beginning of the I guess, Great Depression proper, if that's what you want to call it. Okay. So, like I said, some rural banks begin to fail early into the mid 1920s. Okay, now next is going to be credit. And it's not just credit, it's easy credit, unregulated credit. It's easily accessible, unregulated. And what that means is, and I don't know how many of you have credit cards, but now if you go to Macy's or if you go to Belk or whatever stores there are, and you want to get a credit card, they run your credit. And that, believe it or not, is actually a safeguard for you. It may be annoying when you get denied or you have bad credit, so you don't get a loan. But in reality, that is there to safeguard you. Okay. It's saying, listen, you shouldn't get this. And in fact, we're not going to give it to you based on your credit. In the 1920s, that didn't exist. So you could really take out as much debt as you wanted to take out without any issues. And so people were spending way more than they could actually deal with, and was causing some major problems like bankruptcy. Okay. So buying now, paying later, Americans are going to generate enormous debts. Okay. And so as a result of this, once Americans started to learn, because oftentimes we have to go through a problem before we learn from our mistakes. In the 1920s, a lot of Americans began to learn about credit. And so, because of the high debt and credit card bills that they're having to deal with, or credit bills that they're having to deal with, they are cutting back on their spending by the end of the decade. So, by doing that, this is just going to contribute more to that very first cause, which was overproduction and underconsumption. Okay. And here you can see a snapshot of 1929 and what the average household looked like. Average savings was about $1,650, but the average debt is somewhere around $10,500 during 1929, which looks horrible, but it is much worse now. The average household now is over 150,000 in debt when you're looking at house and car and student loans and all that stuff put together. Okay, but anyways, so uneven division of wealth. So this is going to be your wealth gap between the rich and the poor. So despite income actually going up, it's only going up for a few, okay? And it's not going up proportionally, let's put it that way. So the gap between the rich and the poor is going to grow wider and wider. 70% of Americans are considered poor, meaning that they make less or lower than the poverty line. And here you can see this, okay? An income of $2,500 per year is considered the minimum amount for a decent standard of living. So we have way less than that, right? 65% are making 2,000 and under. Okay, so you're really not seeing a large proportion that is living the good life. It's only 1% that's making over 10 grand a year. Okay, so this is showing you that division of wealth. The majority of the spending in the 1920s is done by only 30% of the population. So, again, we always talk about the roaring 20s, but I view that as a misnomer. I don't think that's really correct. I think that it's kind of a false sense of prosperity during the 1920s. Okay, the majority of that good life was being lived by a pretty sizable minority of the population. Okay, now, finally, after all that stuff that we just talked about, let's get to the stock market. Okay, so the stock market is going up in the 1920s. People believe that it will never go down. They're going to do something called speculating with stocks, meaning that they are not truly data driven. They are going to play the stock market without much investment in time, I guess, to understand what they're doing. Um, there's also a term called buying on the margin, which meant that people thinking that the stock market was always going to go up would borrow money to then pay for stocks, which is really a horrible situation. If I, for instance, was to go to Mr. Gormley and say, "Hey, Gorm, uh, I'd like to borrow $50,000, right?" And let's pretend Gorm had that kind of money. And let's pretend that I had a necessity for that type of money for some reason, right? He would be stupid if he just gave it to me without asking me any questions. And if he asked me, okay, sure, what do you need it for? And I said, well, I'm going to take it and I'm going to go to Las Vegas. I'm going to put all 50,000 on red on the roulette table and spin it. Um, that's gambling, right? With money that isn't actually mine. And I'm not saying that the stock market is a true gamble, but it's not necessarily a science, right? It's not guaranteed winnings. And so the last thing that you should ever do is play the stock market with borrowed money. That is a bad situation because if you lose it, then not only can you not pay back the principal, the original loan, but any interest, the loaning institution loses out on that money, and there's a little bit of a ripple effect there. Okay, so that's what buying on the margin is. And it's extremely risky. So these sorts of things are happening on the stock market. There's no regulation. That's the other thing we have to understand. We'll talk about that during the New Deal with the things that are put in place to try to keep that from happening didn't exist in the 1920s. Okay, and so these things ran rampant, right? So that's why I just said there's no regulation on the stock market. No regulation allows some companies to inflate the value of their stock to increase profits, which is illegal now. But in those days, were not necessarily illegal. So you didn't have to be truthful with the health of your company to try to inflate the value of your stock. And so what this does is it creates something called a bubble, um, where there's this elevated value of your business, which is the bubble. So the price is at a certain height per share, but at some point that bubble's going to burst. Reality is going to hit. And when the bubble bursts, that price is going to fall drastically. And if this is something that is compounded from company to company to company to company to company to company, then when that bubble bursts, much like the housing crisis in 2007, when the housing bubble burst, it's gonna cause serious issues. Okay, so here's the stock prices going up, mainly because of all of the craziness, and the stock speculation and the inflated values and buying on the margin, all those things. Then we get the crash. Black Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, the bubble burst. People rush to sell. As soon as the prices start going down, people rush to sell, which only causes the prices to go down faster. Investors lost $14 billion in one day. Okay. This is this is just unbelievable for the American economy. And here you can see the fall of the stocks starting right here in 1929. So this is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of the Great Depression, right? The spark that caused the depression. But just like World War One, there were all sorts of other things that helped to cause it. In World War One, it was militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. Here, it's depressed farming, weak industries, overproduction, underconsumption, easy credit, unregulated credit. All those things were the other causes. But the crash, this is really what um, I guess got the ball rolling for everybody else. Okay, speculators who bought on the margin, they can't pay back loans, they lose their entire savings. We see an increase in suicides as a result of the stock market crash in 29. Depression is going to go up. All sorts of things are kind of a ripple effect from the crash. Now, keep in mind that the stock market in the United States, it doesn't truly directly impact that many Americans. Only about 3 million actively traded. But the ripple effect, and that's what we have to understand, this scared the crap out of people in America. And so when they saw the kind of the teetering status of the American economy, it's going to cause average Americans to do some things, which are only going to exacerbate and grow the issues of the Great Depression. Okay, so let's go ahead and move into that. So next up is bank failures. Okay, and we already talked a little bit about rural bank failures. Now we're going to talk about everybody else. Okay, so after the crash, people are concerned and worried, and they try to withdraw their cash money from the banks. The problem is banks don't have your money on hand. The way that banks make money is they take your money and they loan it to other people. So if everybody went at the same time to draw their money out of the banks, the bank would run out of money. And that's a problem without insurance. Okay. So banks can't produce the money. The banks fail. Banks go bankrupt. Banks become nothing more than just buildings at that point, which is terrifying. All right. Which is only going to cause more people to rush to try to get their money out. It's called a run on the banks. Okay. So as these bank failures skyrocket, right? You're going to see a lot of businesses start to fail because businesses need loans from banks, business loans. And if banks are failing and banks don't have money being invested into them, then businesses can't get loans and business loans. And if businesses start to fail, unemployment goes up and people don't have jobs. They don't have money to put in banks. So hopefully you're seeing here that this is a really bad situation for the American economy. Okay. So in 1929 alone, 600 banks fail because they've run out of money and they don't have the ability to recoup loans because people don't have the money that they loaned out. Okay. So all of this again is compounding on each other. Okay. So the failure of the American banking system leaves a lot of people without any of their life savings to no fault of their own. We're talking about hardworking Americans that get their money, put it in the bank, in their savings account, and then all of a sudden their money's gone and they didn't do anything wrong. Okay? This is the problem. This is why generations like my grandparents who lived through the Depression never fully trusted banks. I always laughed because, just old people being weird and old. But then when I started actually learning about the context of their lives, it's easier to understand, their whole family's lives were ruined because of something that they didn't do, because of banks, okay? Because of bad loans, things like that. So it helps you to kind of understand things like that, okay? Okay, next up, consumer confidence. And this is a good one that we're going to talk about again when we get to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, consumer confidence basically means that Americans lose their jobs and they don't have confidence in the future. So whatever money they do get or they do have, they don't spend. This is important regardless of the time period we're talking. For instance, in my job, I have confidence. I know I'm going to get a paycheck from Gwinnett County Public Schools every single month. I know that with confidence. So I'm more willing to spend all of my money if I wanted to in that month because I know I'm getting it again. If I truly was not confident that I was going to get a check next month, I probably would not spend as much money as I do normally because I don't have confidence that I'm going to get money again and I have to feed my family. So this is a big problem. And just to give you a little bit of foreshadowing, one of the most famous lines from inauguration speeches ever is FDR's "We have nothing to fear but fear itself." It sounds really cool until you learn he's just talking about consumer confidence. He's talking about the economy, right? But the only thing we truly have to fear is fear. If we are confident, if we trust, then the economy will come back. That's very difficult to do. Okay. So consumer confidence is a big one. Unemployment gets to 25%. A lack of consumer confidence and spending makes the Depression drag all the way to World War II. It is not until World War II begins that the Great Depression ends. Okay. And we'll talk a lot more about that as we move through this unit. Yeah. Also, foreign trade. The Great Depression is a global depression, partly because of trade wars. Okay. In order to protect American companies, the government is going to pass one of the highest tariffs of all time. It's called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930. This is Herbert Hoover. We're going to talk more about Hoover here in a few minutes. But this raises the tariff. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods, on foreign products. So we're going to raise the tariff to 60%. And this is going to cause some American businesses to raise their prices because they can. But also, it's going to cause European nations to create high tariffs on American goods. And so global trade is going to fall. Okay. And you're going to see over time, right here, uh, global trade, imports and exports, is going to fall through the early part of the Great Depression. So this is not just a United States depression. This is a European depression, German depression, French, British. This is a global depression. And, to get off topic here for a second, which I said I wasn't going to do, but I'm doing anyways, the depression of the 30s and the late 20s, this is what helps give rise to totalitarian leaders in Europe, like uh, Benito Mussolini and, of course, Adolf Hitler in Germany. This is part of what happens to help produce that. Okay? All right. So the impact of the Great Depression, very quickly, let's run through these things. We lose confidence in banks. 25,000 banks are going to fail. The lack of banking means that there's no money for investment, no money for businesses. So 90,000 businesses are going to close, which means that unemployment is going to go up and peak at 25% of American unemployment. People lose their homes, they're going to lose their farms, they're going to lose their businesses, they're going to lose everything. We have record poverty. We have record suicide rates. Healthcare is going to decline. People don't have the money to take care of themselves. This is a perfect storm of negativity for the United States during the 1930s. But we are going to see some churches and charities open up to offer soup kitchens and bread lines. I think we've seen this before. I believe maybe it's one of my favorite photographs in American history, just because of the ironic message. The world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And then you have this group of people with baskets and buckets waiting to get soup and bread, right? It doesn't seem like a really great way of living, but nonetheless, that is the way that life was in America. Okay. So let's jump into a little bit of beating us while we're down, and it's the Dust Bowl. Happens in the mid 1930s. Okay, the Great Depression was kind of a human-made situation in America, but the Dust Bowl was Mother Nature. It was environmental, and it was truly Mother Nature kicking America in the throat while we were already on the ground. It is a horrible situation that compounds the issues of the agricultural region of America. We're going to see droughts. We're going to see overfarming of the soil. So that is a little bit man-made, right? But we're going to see huge droughts, which dry out the soil that's already torched from overfarming. And then we're going to see these windstorms in 1930s that will pick up feet of loose soil and create these horrific dust storms like what these photographs are right here. These are not mountains, right? This is a literal dust storm. There are stories of people being in pitch dark for days in the middle of one of these dust storms. They would cut open cattle after a dust storm that died of asphyxiation, right? And their stomachs and esophagus and lungs would just be full of dust and dirt and soil. They basically drowned on dirt, which is horrifying. Um, but nonetheless, okay, farmers of the Great Plains, there's nothing they can do. They can't farm, so they have to leave. And they're going to be called Okies and Arkies because a lot of them come from Oklahoma and Arkansas. And they're going to move west and they're going to look for work in California. Okay. And then, of course, here we have another photograph from Dorothea Lange. We've seen this before, I think. I think that was in APUSH. I told you that we were going to look at some more photographs by Dorothea Lange. And this one's called The Migrant Mother. This woman, her husband has just left her. She's on the road to California. She's got her children with her, 3 kids. Believe it or not, she's in her early 30s. She's actually younger than me, which, she looks like she's lived a few lives already. Um, but, life gets better for her. She remarries and lives a pretty good long life. But, in this moment, this is pretty tragic. And this becomes kind of a symbol of the Great Depression um, during this time period. This poor baby, I can't even imagine trying to live through something like this. But anyways, okay. So Herbert Hoover, the president that is, supposed to lead and help, does absolutely nothing. Okay, remember, he is the third in the line of Republican presidents during this decade which believe in laissez-faire, rejecting bold action by the government. He believes in rugged individualism, that Americans need to just deal with it and the depression will end and things will get better. Now, he may be correct, but that's not necessarily what Americans want to hear. They want a leader that's going to help. Now, as things worsen, okay, we're going to see that he does try to fix things. Okay, he kind of pivots a little bit on what his original ideology is, kind of that Andrew Mellon style supply side, blah blah blah, right? Um, so he finally does call for more government action, but it's too late. Okay, he's going to help push Congress to create the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which loans money to businesses, still sticking to that supply side economic system of helping business, and it will trickle down to everybody else. But again, too late. Now, he also does start something that FDR continues in the New Deal, which is public works projects like creating dams. And if you've ever been to Hoover Dam, I haven't. It's one of my bucket list things. It is enormous. okay, and it generates a ton of electricity. But this was something that was started during his presidency to put people back to work, okay? But of course, too late. Now, most Americans, lose faith in Hoover. Here's a political cartoon that shows that. Everybody blames Hoover. Remember, he is the leader at the time. A lot of this stuff isn't because of him specifically, but he also doesn't do much to help. Okay. Uh, Homeless Americans are going to start building these shanty towns, and they're going to call them Hoovervilles as an insult. They're going to cover themselves with newspapers and call them Hoover blankets. There's all sorts of what the children used to say. I don't know if it's a term with y'all anymore, but a whole bunch of shade is going to be thrown on Herbert Hoover during this time period. Okay, now the last straw, and then we're done. I know I've talked way too long, and I'm very sorry, but there's a lot of stuff here. The last straw is going to be the bonus army. And this is a fiasco. This is Herbert Hoover being a moronic idiot. All right, so let's get into this. World War I veterans, and I'm sorry, if there's one group of Americans that everybody gets upset about if they're mistreated, it's veterans. Okay, and especially veterans of actual war, right? World War I vets. So here's what happens. World War I vets are going to march on Washington to demand Congress pay their entire bonus. They were promised a bonus during World War I to be paid in 1924, and it was deferred to be paid in 1945, which sucks anyways. But now they're in a depression, and they're going to demand Congress give them their bonuses now, immediately, when we need them. They're going to call themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force. Remember, during World War I, they were known as the American Expeditionary Force. So this is them. Okay, they're marching on the Capitol. Um, they're going to protest and demand and lobby and all those sorts of things. Now, when I say march on the Capitol, I'm not talking January 6th crazy people, running through the hallways with, their moron signs on their face. That's not what I'm talking about. They are just petitioning. They're marching on Washington under their right to petition the government of grievances, and so that's what's happening here in um, in this time period. Okay, so Congress is going to vote to deny the veterans' request, which is Congress. So where does Hoover come into play here? Why is he blamed for this? Well, here's why. Okay, um, Hoover orders the marchers to leave Washington, D.C., but he goes further than that and he starts to call them names. He calls them riffraff, which is a negative, right? Saying that you're just up to no good. You're just, riffraff, and Reds. So he's going to call these American war hero veterans from World War I communists. Okay. Um, and then he's going to order General Douglas MacArthur, which we'll talk about a lot more in World War II, to push them out. Bayonets are going to be used, tear gas is going to be used. Here you can actually see them fighting with these veterans. And here you can see their tent town burned. Some people actually were killed, including a baby during this. And so this is bad PR. During by the way, this was during an election year. Okay, so Herbert Hoover, this is about as dumb as you can get. And there's no chance that he's going to win the election in 32. And of course, this is when we see Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Okay, but that's for another Ed puzzle. I really have a feeling this one was long, and I'm going to say I'm sorry, but I have a feeling y'all don't care that I'm sorry. But hopefully, you learned some stuff, you took some notes, and we'll talk about all this stuff on our next live day. Okay, guys, have a wonderful day, and I'll talk to you later.